The desperate call Ambassador Crystallis floated in the quantum communication chamber of New Prism, the capital city of the Zephyrian Republic. Her crystalline form pulsed with deep purple worry patterns as she watched the holographic displays, showing the systematic destruction of her people's outer colonies. The Zephyrians were beings of living crystal who had evolved on the methane-rich moons of gas giants, building magnificent cities from grown silicon and harvesting energy from stellar radiation. For 12,000 years, they had lived in perfect harmony with their environment, creating art, philosophy, and science that had earned them respect throughout the civilized galaxy. Now, everything they had built was being consumed by an enemy they barely understood. The Devourers had appeared 3 months ago at the edge of Zephyrian space, emerging from the deep void between galaxies like hungry shadows. Their ships were unlike anything in the galactic database's massive, organic-looking constructs that seemed to be grown rather than built. When they reached a star system, they would position themselves around the local sun and begin draining its energy, converting the stellar matter into more ships and processing facilities. Planets became mining operations, moons became factories, and entire solar systems were stripped bare within weeks. The first colony to fall had been Shimmer Station, a beautiful research outpost orbiting a binary star. The Zephyrian scientists there had been studying stellar formation when the Devourer fleet materialized around them. The initial contact had seemed promising. The machines had responded to communication attempts with complex mathematical patterns that SUGGESTED intelligence. But within hours, the researchers realized the terrible truth. The Devourers weren't interested in communication or negotiation. They were simply cataloging the energy output of every living being in the system before beginning the harvest. The destruction had been methodical and complete. Every Zephyrian on Shimmer Station had been converted into pure energy and fed into the Devourer processing matrix. The research facility, built from centuries of carefully grown crystal formations, had been dissolved and reformed into geometric feeding apparatus. The binary star itself had been partially consumed, its mass converted into hundreds of new Devourer ships that immediately set course for the next Zephyrian system. Crystallis accessed the memory crystals that contained reports from the few survivors who had managed to escape before the harvest began. Flight Captain Resonance had piloted his exploration vessel through a dangerous asteroid field to avoid the Devourer patrols, documenting everything he witnessed. His recordings showed machines that operated with perfect efficiency, dismantling entire worlds like clockwork mechanisms. They showed no emotion, no hesitation, and no mercy. They simply consumed everything in their path and moved on to the next target. The Zephyrian military, such as it was, had proven completely ineffective against the invaders. Their ships were designed for exploration and research, equipped with mining lasers and defensive shields, but nothing that could match the devastating weapons of the Devourer fleet. Every attempt at organized resistance had ended in complete annihilation. The machines learned from each encounter, adapting their tactics and weapons to counter any new defensive strategy the Zephyrians attempted. Desperate for allies, the Zephyrian High Council had reached out to every major civilization in the galaxy. The responses had been uniformly disappointing. The Altarian Trade Federation had offered to evacuate Zephyrian cultural artifacts for preservation in their museums, but claimed their military forces were committed elsewhere. The Crystalline Collective had expressed sympathy but explained that their defensive philosophy prevented them from engaging in offensive operations. The Void Dancers had simply ignored all communication attempts entirely. Most crushing of all had been the response from the Galactic Council itself. The Council's military arm, the peacekeeping force, had acknowledged the Devourer threat, but classified it as a localized crisis that didn't warrant large-scale intervention. They had offered to establish refugee processing centers in neutral space, effectively writing off the entire Zephyrian Republic as already lost. The cold political calculation was clear: no major power wanted to risk their own forces to save a relatively small civilization on the galaxy's rim. That was when Chris had begun researching species that weren't part of the mainstream galactic community. Her searches through the deep archives had uncovered references to dozens of isolated civilizations, quarantined worlds, and classified contact protocols. Most were either extinct, too primitive to be useful, or too dangerous to approach. But one entry had caught her attention, buried deep in a restricted military database that she had accessed through her diplomatic credentials. The file was labeled Sol System, Homeworld Classification, Extreme Hazard, Species Status, Quarantine Maintained. The basic information was sparse but intriguing. The system contained a single inhabited world designated as Terra, home to a species that had somehow achieved flight, despite living on what the Galactic Survey described as a Class X death world. The environmental conditions were listed as universally lethal to known galactic life forms: massive temperature variations, violent weather systems, high radiation exposure, toxic atmospheric composition, and aggressive biological hazards at every level of the ecosystem. More interesting were the scattered intelligence reports about the species itself. Humans, as they called themselves, had survived multiple extinction events on their homeworld and had developed technology through constant warfare against their environment and each other. The few contact attempts had been unsuccessful, not because the humans were hostile, but because their world was too dangerous for survey teams to survive long enough to establish meaningful communication. The most recent entry was over 800 years old and simply stated that the quarantine zone around the Sol System should be maintained indefinitely. What made Crystallis pay attention was a single line buried in the appendix of the file. It mentioned that during the last major galactic conflict, over 3,000 years ago, there had been unconfirmed reports of human vessels operating in deep space, engaging unknown hostiles with unprecedented effectiveness. The report was marked as unverified, investigation terminated due to crew losses, and had apparently been classified so deeply that even diplomatic access barely reached it. 3,000 years ago was exactly when the galaxy's historical records mentioned the last appearance of the Devourers. Ancient texts spoke of machine intelligences that had consumed entire star systems before mysteriously disappearing back into the void between galaxies. The timing was too coincidental to ignore, especially when conventional forces had proven completely ineffective against the current Devourer invasion. The decision to contact Earth had not been easy. The High Council had debated for days about the wisdom of reaching out to a species that the galaxy had quarantined for obvious safety reasons. Some council members argued that any civilization living on such a hostile world would be too alien and dangerous to trust. Others worried that humans might be extinct, or too primitive to offer meaningful assistance. But with Devourer forces advancing through Zephyrian space and conventional allies refusing to help, the risks of inaction outweighed the dangers of contact. Crystallis had spent weeks crafting the message, encoding it in every mathematical language protocol in the galactic database. The transmission would need to travel through several relay stations to reach the Sol System, and there was no guarantee that humans would even receive it, much less understand it. The message itself was carefully worded to convey the of their situation without revealing too much about Zephyrian capabilities or the galaxy's general state of affairs. The response had arrived just 12 hours after the transmission reached Earth's outer system. It was brief, transmitted in perfect galactic standard, and signed by someone identified as Captain Sarah Chen, Terran Defense Coalition, Deep Space Command. The message had contained technical specifications that demonstrated an understanding of both Devourer technology and interstellar travel that shouldn't have been possible for a quarantined civilization. Most unsettling was the casual way that humans had discussed deployment timelines and tactical assessments, as if responding to galactic-scale threats was routine business. Now, as Crystalis watched the latest reports from the Zephyrian outer colonies, she wondered if her desperate gamble would pay off. The Devourers were accelerating their advance, consuming entire systems in days rather than weeks. Long-range sensors showed massive fleet movements converging on the Zephyrian core worlds. An intelligence analysis suggested the machines were preparing for a final, overwhelming assault that would end the Republic within a month. The humans had promised assistance, but they remained a complete unknown. They might arrive as saviors, or they might prove to be an even greater threat than the machines already consuming her people's worlds. All Crystalis could do was wait, and hope that her desperate call for help hadn't doomed her civilization to an even worse fate. Asterisk. When Deathworlders answered, the human fleet emerged from quantum space like predators materializing from a nightmare. Crystalis watched from the command center of New Prism as reality itself seemed to tear open along the edges of the home system, revealing vessels that defied everything she thought she knew about starship design. These weren't the elegant curves and crystalline beauty that characterized most galactic civilizations, nor were they the organic horror of the Devourer machines. They were angular, brutal constructs that looked like they had been forged in the heart of a star and designed by a species that expected to fight. For every breath they took, the lead vessel identified itself as the Terran Defense Coalition flagship, indomitable, and even its name carried implications that made Crystalis's crystal form flicker with nervous patterns. Captain Sarah Chen requested immediate communication protocols and tactical data about current Devourer positions. Her transmission, carrying an undertone of professional competence that suggested this wasn't humanity's first encounter with existential threats. Within minutes of arrival, human ships were deploying throughout the system in formations that spoke of military doctrines refined through countless battles. Captain Chen materialized as a hologram in the Zephyrian command center, and Crystalis immediately understood why the galaxy had quarantined Earth. The human commander was tall and lean, with the kind of controlled tension that came from living on a world where relaxation meant death. Her dark eyes moved constantly, assessing threats and calculating tactical advantages even during what was supposed to be a diplomatic meeting. When she spoke, her voice carried the flat professionalism of someone who had seen civilizations rise and fall and had learned to focus on solutions rather than mourning losses. The cultural shock was immediate and mutual. Chen studied the Zephyrian command center with obvious confusion, noting the complete absence of weapons control stations, tactical coordination equipment, or defensive planning facilities. To human eyes, the beautiful crystal chambers must have looked like art galleries pretending to be military headquarters. Meanwhile, Crystalis and her staff were struggling to process the implications of a species that had developed faster than light. Travel while living on a world so hostile that most galactic civilizations couldn't survive there for minutes. Chun's briefing about human capabilities was both reassuring and terrifying. The Terran Defense Coalition maintained active fleets throughout human space, with ships designed specifically for fighting existential threats that could end civilizations. They had encountered machine intelligences before, defeated hive minds that consumed planets, and survived conflicts that had lasted for centuries. Most disturbing was Chun's casual mention that Earth itself had been invaded multiple times by hostile alien forces, and that humanity had not only survived, but had learned to track down and eliminate the sources of such threats. Lieutenant Commander Torres, Chen's intelligence officer, presented an analysis of the Devourer invasion that was more comprehensive than anything Zephyrian scientists had managed in months of study. The humans had apparently been monitoring the situation since the first Devourer ships appeared, tracking their movements through deep space. Sensor networks that shouldn't have existed according to galactic technological databases. They had decoded Devourer communication protocols, mapped their command structure, and identified critical vulnerabilities in their processing systems. Most shocking was Torres's revelation that the Devourers weren't unknown to humanity. According to human historical records, these same machines had attempted to invade the Sol system over 3,000 years ago, during Earth's early space age. The attack had been repelled by what human archives described as a desperate alliance between Earth's various nations, using weapons that had apparently been developed specifically for fighting machine intelligences. The victory had been costly, with several human colonies destroyed and millions of casualties, but it had driven the Devourers back into deep space. Chen explained that humanity had spent the intervening millennia preparing for the machine's return. Earth's quarantine status wasn't just about protecting other species from human aggression, it was about maintaining operational security for a civilization that had been quietly building the galaxy's most advanced anti-machine warfare capabilities. Human ships carried weapons designed to disrupt hive mind communications, armor that could resist energy conversion processes, and tactical systems optimized for fighting enemies that learned and adapted from every encounter. The human fleet composition was unlike anything in Crystalise's experience. Instead of the multi-role vessels that most civilizations favored, the humans had brought specialized ships designed for specific combat roles. Dreadnoughts carried heavy weapons meant to break through Devourer defenses, while destroyers hunted. Enemy scout ships with ruthless efficiency. Support vessels provided electronic warfare capabilities that could blind machine sensors and disrupt their coordination networks. Every ship was armed with weapons that most galactic civilizations would consider war crimes, designed not just to destroy enemies, but to ensure they couldn't adapt or learn from the encounter. As the human fleet took defensive positions throughout Zephyrian space, long-range sensors detected the approaching Devourer armada. Over 800 machine ships were converging on the system, including massive factory vessels that could convert entire planets into processing stations within days. The scale of the threat was overwhelming, but Chun's response was to request additional tactical data and begin coordinating with human reinforcement fleets that were apparently already en route from other sectors. The battle began at the edge of the system, where human destroyer squadrons engaged Devourer scout formations in running firefights that demonstrated the difference between galactic and human approaches to warfare. Zephyrian military doctrine emphasized minimizing casualties and preserving infrastructure, but the humans fought with calculated brutality that prioritized mission success over everything else. They used their own ships as weapons, ramming damaged vessels into enemy formations and detonating reactor cores to maximize destruction. Chen's tactical coordination was a masterpiece of military science, orchestrating fleet movements across multiple star systems while simultaneously managing supply lines, casualty evacuation, and intelligence gathering. She treated the destruction of entire devourer formations as routine business, discussing acceptable loss ratios and strategic sacrifice zones with the same tone other species used for trade negotiations. When Crystallis expressed horror at the human casualty reports, Chen simply explained that Earth's military doctrine accepted that some battles could only be won through sacrifice. The turning point came when the main Devourer fleet entered the system and encountered the full strength of the human battle line. The machines had apparently expected to face the same poorly equipped resistance they had encountered throughout Zephyrian space, but instead found themselves fighting an enemy that understood their weaknesses and had developed specific countermeasures. Human weapons tore through Devourer defenses with unprecedented effectiveness, while electronic warfare systems disrupted the hive-mind communications that coordinated machine operations. Most devastating was humanity's use of what Chen called viral protocols, computer viruses, specifically designed to infiltrate and corrupt machine intelligence networks. The programs spread through Devourer communication channels like a plague, turning their own coordination systems against them and causing entire formations to attack each other in confusion. It was warfare at a level that most galactic civilizations couldn't even comprehend, fought with weapons that attacked the enemy's fundamental nature rather than just their physical ships. The Devourer response was swift and terrifying. The machine intelligence recognized the human fleet as the same species that had defeated them millennia ago, and began deploying weapons and tactics that hadn't been seen since the ancient galactic wars. Reality warping technologies that could crush entire star systems, energy weapons that could ignite planets, and swarm tactics that involved sacrificing thousands of ships to overwhelm human defenses. The scale of destruction was beyond anything Crystallis had imagined possible, with entire regions of space becoming uninhabitable battlefields. But humanity had prepared for exactly this kind of conflict. Chun's fleet included vessels equipped with experimental weapons that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. Technologies developed through centuries of fighting existential threats. They deployed gravitational manipulators that could collapse enemy formations, quantum disruptors that severed machine communication networks, and weapons that attacked the fundamental forces holding Devourer ships together. Every human tactical innovation was matched by machine adaptations, creating an escalating arms race that threatened to tear apart the fabric of space itself. The final engagement lasted 18 hours and ended with the complete annihilation of the Devourer invasion force. Human casualties were severe. Nearly 30% of Chen's fleet had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair, but the machines had been eliminated so thoroughly that their recycling protocols couldn't recover enough material to rebuild. More importantly, human intelligence teams had captured intact Devourer communication systems and used them to trace the machines back to their base of operations in deep space. As the battle ended and human rescue teams began searching for survivors, Crystallis realized that her people's desperate call for help had fundamentally changed the balance of power in the galaxy. Humanity hadn't just saved the Zephyrian Republic, they had revealed themselves as the galaxy's most capable military force. A civilization of apex predators who had quietly been preparing for threats that other species couldn't even imagine. The quarantine around Earth hadn't been about protecting the galaxy from humans, it'd been about protecting humans from the galaxy's politics and distractions while they built the ultimate defense against existential threats. Chun's final message to the Zephyrian High Council was characteristically direct. Earth was prepared to offer protection to any civilization threatened by forces beyond their capacity to resist. But such protection came with expectations of cooperation and mutual defense obligations. The galaxy was apparently far more dangerous than most species realized, filled with threats that required constant vigilance and willingness to fight. Humanity had spent millennia becoming the guardians the galaxy needed, even if most civilizations had never realized they needed guardians at all. Asterisk.